name is Edward Laatsch, and I'm the youngest son of Doris Merrill, who was born and raised in Hutchinson, Minnesota. My memories from the house date back a ways. I was the youngest of my family members, and my grandparents, my Appa and Nana, which was Genevieve and Louis Merrill, died when I was not quite a teenager. So my memories date back from when I was a youngster. And I remember playing in my grandfather's study, which was always a treasure trove of interesting things, including, I believe, one of the very first Xerox machines ever sold by the Xerox company. It was a bellows and a fold-up thing and involved chemicals, and as an 11-year-old, I spent the whole afternoon figuring out how to use up all of his precious paper and make copies of I don't know what. But I remember that, and I remember my grandmother's, my Nana's dog, Ginger, a little Cocker Spaniel, who was a nice little girl, but she'd growl at you every time you tried to pet her. Other than that, I always remember the house as being a focal point for the city. Whenever we'd come and visit, my aunt and uncle, us and other family members would all gather here, and it was always a place of lots of activity and lots of fun, especially around the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas in particular. Another story I remember being told as a very young fellow was the story about my great-great-grandfather, Lewis Harrington. He was a surveyor, amongst other things, and the story goes that as his job as a surveyor took him further and further west as the United States was mapping and surveying the western United States. First in the Dakotas, then Montana, and eventually to Washington Territory. And first the story goes that he would spend 6 months here, and then he'd spend 6 months on the road. And the joke was that his wife was always glad to see him come home, and after 6 months, she was always glad to see him leave. But the real sort of family tidbit is, we're told, and it was related to us, that he met his demise when he met and was pushed off a cliff by Indians in the Washington Territory. Now, of course, we can't prove that for a certainty, but that's how it was handed down to us. And that's the story we've been telling through the years and believe it to be true. So when we were looking through some of the older materials we had stored away, we discovered this hat. And the hat is the Mr. Hutchinson hat from 1957 from the Water Carnival. And it was the hat given to and worn by my Appa, Louis Merrill, who was Mr. Hutchinson that year. And what it sparked in me is a number of memories about how he conducted his life and how he did things. And he and I shared a couple of things, one of which were both civil engineers. And he did some surveying work and civil engineering work for railroads and others in his early days. And I was always fascinated when I found out he was ambidextrous. And in the process of creating these large plats for like railroad right-of-ways, these were 6 or 7 foot pieces of paper. And he had the ability, using this very smearable ink, of working on one side of the drawing with his left hand and then grabbing the ink pen without a motionless hesitation, then continuing on to the other side of the chart. And I always thought, as a young boy, what a fascinating skill to have. Another thing I remember him telling me was that he said, Ed, you know, about every 10 years or so, you've learned pretty much most of what you need to know about a subject, whether it's engineering or being a agricultural representative for the county, whatever else it is. And so he says, in my life, I found that about every 10 years or so, I change what I'm doing and I find another avocation to explore. He says, I've done that most of my life. From engineer to gentleman farmer to town elder or whatever else it happens to be. Something else that was always around me as a child growing up was education. Our family felt strongly about education. And I come from a family of teachers, particularly on the Merrill side of the house. And for an engineering student and a young kid who liked science, whose handwriting was just awful, I was left-handed and was constantly smearing my work all the time. It seemed strange that I would have grown up in a family where both of my sisters eventually became teachers. My mother became a teacher later in life. My mother's mother was a teacher. Her father was a teacher and superintendent of the Hutchinson schools, and there are even teachers going back to the early days before our ancestors were in Hutchinson, including one of my ancestors who was a professor at Brown University. So wherever I turned, it seemed, I couldn't get away from teachers and education. So basically, it was hard to get away with anything. So yeah, there are a couple of pictures here in this box that show holiday season in 1958, December of 1958. So it was the Christmas holidays, and it shows the house as it was at that point. And as we look behind us and see the house where it stands, there was a section of the house that extended further out towards the garage that had a living room in the front, and behind it to the rear was a kitchen. Also above the kitchen, there was a porch roof that came off of one of the bedrooms with a set of stairs that came down the back of the house. Well, at least during my time out here in the 60s, this door was sort of at the back corner of the living room, and it was mostly ornamental, and I rarely remember anybody going in or out of it. There was a porch out here, but it was a simple little thing, and nothing at all like what's here now. The main traffic always occurred through the front door, through the kitchen, and then out the back door.
What?
Sure. So of course, this is largely unchanged. This was the big family room with the fireplace, which is no longer, which was added, I understand it, in a major renovation. And there was a big grandfather clock. I can't tell you exactly where it's set, and built-in bookshelves along that back wall, if I remember. And it was fairly ornate, gold leaf or gold flocked wallpaper. It was a very, I was going to say, what do you say, a very elegant home. Well appointed, and Appa and Nana, as I called them, were I guess, leading citizens of the community, and they conducted themselves as such. I remember for certain that whenever I was here visiting and whenever Nana was around, she could be counted on to be sitting in a rocking chair with a lamp right next to her, sitting there sort of keeping her eye on things, all things around the house, and usually with her hand on the head of and petting a small Cocker Spaniel named Ginger, who would alternately growl and sleep. And so that's my memory of this room and of me wandering around and looking at all the nooks and crannies, because at the time I was perhaps 7 or 8 or 9. Some of the house, as we see it now, it's almost hard for me to recall what the arrangements and how it was organized at the time. These stairs were here, and as was the landing. But with the passage of time, and this has been almost 50 years now, it's hard to recall, except that I do know for sure that the front door to the house was right here, and that this now 2-story, but formerly 1-story vestibule had stairs and a doorway, and this was the anteroom you stepped in before you came to the front door. And if you turned to the left, you went right into a living room, a dining room, the formal dining room. And on the other side of the dining room, in a separate room with a pair of doors that opened onto it, was my grandfather's study. It was a fairly substantial study. It was a big study, had a big desk at one end, windows all around, and then if you went through the living room and back, you went into the kitchen or into a little hallway with a bathroom, and then I think out into the backyard. So the house was a good bit bigger on this end, but largely what you see here on this end.